It's such a beautiful afternoon. Can we do better? Good afternoon, everyone. Good afternoon. We are here, of course, to celebrate the work of Reverend Wyatt T. Walker and the collection that we now have held here at the University of Richmond Boatwright Memorial Library. I want to welcome everyone here today. This symposium today is part of a series in the School of Arts and Sciences here at the University of Richmond called Contested Spaces, Race, Nation, and Conflict. This is a school over which I am Dean, Arts and Sciences. My name is Patrice Rankin. I'm a professor of classics here and Dean of the School of Arts and Sciences. For this series, I want to mention the work of Kirsten Petrocelli in my office, Director of Operations and Strategic Initiatives. She's standing back there. Thank you for your work. And also the work of Nicole Sackley, our Associate Professor in the Department of History and Program Coordinator in American Studies, who is sitting here as well. And I'll be introducing and talking a little bit more about some of the people involved in the collection and in this day momentarily. For now, I do want to give welcome also to the family of Wyatt T. Walker. If you're here, perhaps might you stand and receive greetings from our audience. It's wonderful that you are here. And as we go into the panel and questions come up, we're going to pass around a microphone. You'll have an opportunity to introduce yourself by microphone. I'm sure there are others in the audience from whom we'll want to hear, and you'll have an opportunity to introduce yourself and tell us who you are and what brings you here today. For now, I would like to introduce our president at the University of Richmond, Dr. Ronald Crutcher. Ronald A. Crutcher will bring us greetings as well. Dr. Crutcher is a national leader in higher education and a distinguished classical musician and professor of music. He became president and professor of music at the University of Richmond in 2015, having previously served as president of Wheaton College in Massachusetts for 10 years. Throughout his career, Dr. Crutcher has actively promoted access, affordability, and inclusive excellence. I love reading that line because President Crutcher was one of the first leaders in higher education to begin to, with AAC&U, craft this phrase of inclusive excellence. And I don't know if people here at the university understand that we are also in the presence of a legend in higher education, and I'm pleased to be working with him. He writes and speaks widely on the democratic purposes and civic mission of higher education and is founding co-chair of Liberal Education in America's Promise, or LEAP, the Association of the American Colleges and Universities national campaign to demonstrate the value of liberal education. He is a Phi Beta Kappa graduate of Miami University in Ohio and earned his master's and doctoral degrees at Yale University. He currently performs in the United States and Europe as a member of the Klemperer Trio. Please welcome Dr. Crutcher.
Thank you so much, Dean Rankin, and good afternoon, everyone. That was pretty weak. Good afternoon, everyone. It is indeed a pleasure to welcome you all to the University of Richmond and to this inaugural Wyatt T. Walker Symposium. I'm so pleased to see so many friends, particularly the Walker family, in the audience to celebrate the life and legacy of Wyatt T. Walker. We are particularly really deeply grateful to the family for donating this extraordinary collection of Dr. Walker's papers, materials, and artifacts to the university, and are committed to advancing scholarly work through the Dr. and Mrs. Wyatt T. Walker collection at the Boatwright Memorial Library. I'd like to begin by acknowledging our Boatwright Library staff, especially Linda Kachurik back there. Linda, stand up, please. Linda is the head of Rare Book and Special Collections, and I want to thank her in particular for her expertise and care in bringing this collection to life. We're pleased to be joined today by an exceptional panel of speakers, including Dr. Corey Walker, Vice President, Dean, and Professor of Religion and Society at Virginia Union University, Reverend Chris Dorsey, to my right, President of the Higher Education Leadership Ministries, of the Christian Church Disciples of Christ, Professor Laura Browder, the Tyler and Alice Haynes Professor of American Studies here at the University of Richmond, and Professor Thad Williamson, Associate Professor of Leadership Studies and Philosophy, Politics, Economics, and Law at the University of Richmond. And we're honored to welcome our keynote speaker, Dr. Joseph Evans, Dean of the Morehouse School of Religion, and very much look forward to his remarks. And of course, we're grateful to each of you for joining us today. This past February, I was privileged to speak at Dr. Walker's memorial service in Petersburg. In those remarks, I shared my honor in having personally crossed paths with Dr. Walker several times in my life. As fellow musicians, I liken my memories of him to a familiar refrain between favorite verses. I first encountered Dr. Walker as a child around the age of 10 or 11 at Zion Baptist Church in Cincinnati, Ohio. Zion Baptist in the 50s and 60s was at the forefront of the civil rights movement in Ohio. And Dr. Martin Luther King and my minister, Dr. L. Benchel Booth, were very close colleagues. In fact, Reverend Booth preached the eulogy at Mrs. Alberta King's funeral at Dr. King's request. In those unsettled yet exhilarating days, the guest ministers whom Reverend Booth invited to Zion included civil rights luminaries such as Reverend Gardner C. Taylor, Reverend Ralph David Abernathy, Dr. Samuel Proctor, Dr. Benjamin Hayes, and of course, Dr. Walker and Dr. King. Listening to them preach was an education in duty, purpose, and courage. Only as I got older did I realize fully the significance of what I had encountered. Shortly after arriving in Richmond, I invited Dr. Walker to this campus and led him on a tour. In fact, Linda was there. During our ride, I shared with him that I had heard him speak at Zion on more than one occasion. He told me that he was indeed good friends with Reverend Booth, Vink, as he called him, and we began trading details of the series of meetings at Zion in November 1961, where Reverend Booth facilitated the discussion in which concerns were expressed about the direction of the National Baptist Convention. Those discussions attracted 33 delegates from 14 states who convened over the course of 2 days, culminating in the founding of the Progressive National Baptist Convention. As an active member of the Zion congregation, my father, A.J. Crutcher Jr., served in a number of capacities during the convention, and I, 13 years old, eagerly assisted him. I sat quietly in the back of the room listening to the robust discussions, tying the new convention's ideas to issues of freedom and civil and human rights. And I remember the voices of the men's choir raised in song, a chorus that was strong, determined, and hopeful, and echoed the spirit of centuries of our musical traditions. Regrettably, I don't recall if Dr. Walker told me he attended the convention or not. However, he was indeed instrumental in the formation and growth of the PNPC and is considered one of its founding fathers. And I was profoundly flattered that he wanted to hear my firsthand account. After earning degrees in musical arts and pursuing careers in higher education and professional music, I attended several of Dr. Walker's services at Canaan Baptist Church in Harlem. My deep admiration for Dr. Walker notwithstanding, no self-respecting musician could claim his education complete without worshiping and singing at his pulpit. Visitors from all over the world were seated in the balcony and introduced warmly to the congregation. The choir was a revelation, exaltation booming off the rafters. I cannot imagine heaven's chorus sounding any sweeter. Soon after I was appointed as president of the University of Richmond, I learned that Dr. Walker had donated his papers and artifacts to the university to facilitate the future work of scholars of the civil rights movement. Our goal, consistent with the wishes of the Walker family, is to make this important record of resilience, perseverance, and triumph accessible to those who would champion and protect the causes of freedom. Today, we honor that pledge with this inaugural symposium to introduce formally the Walker Collection to each of you. A scholar himself, Dr. Walker always understood the need for preservation, particularly of Black history, religion, and culture. In his book, Spirits That Dwell in Deep Woods, the prayer and praise hymns of the Black religious experience, he writes, and I quote, "What presently remains of its legacy is in the hearts and minds of the present generation of the Black aged. If this treasure is not mined and preserved now, we risk losing it forever." End of quote. Because of all that he shared with us and the enthusiastic response to the collection we formally celebrate today, we do not fear the loss of the memory of Wyatt T. Walker. Dr. Walker bequeathed his life's work to scholars, students, and citizens alike so that they may be inspired by his messages of equality, nonviolence, and hope. We are humbled by our mission and will mine his treasure and preserve his legacy for all days. Indeed, the memory of Dr. Walker calls on us all to continue contemplating the world not as it is, but as it might be. And so I close my remarks with the words of the composer, scholar, singer, social activist, Bernice Johnson Reagan from Ella's song, and I'll share them with you now. "That which touches me most is that I had a chance to work with people, passing on to others that which was passed on to me. We who believe in freedom cannot rest. We who believe in freedom cannot rest until it's done." Thank you for all that you do to advance the abiding and reverend works of Dr. Walker, and enjoy your day today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Crutcher. I'm going to call attention to a couple more people and offices, just because the work that we do is never in silo. We work together with a number of people on campus to do an event like this. And before turning to the panel, I just wanted to make sure you're aware of their presence here. So thanks again to the President and his office for their work. I want to call attention to the Center for Civic Engagement. I saw Amy Howard, but now I don't. Here you are for your collaboration on this event. The work of Glenn Hughes in Common Ground, the real center for diversity and inclusion on campus among students and among many faculty on campus, and the chaplaincy, who is also present. You'll hear from Craig Coker a little bit later, our chaplain, our university chaplain. I want to shout out Kathy Lang. I don't know if she's here in the school. Wonderful. So good that you're here. Please stand. We know that the work of getting this collection here at the university was in no small part due to your efforts. So I just wanted to make sure that people knew that and saw you. So welcome. I'm glad you are here. Kevin Butterfield, our Director of Libraries. You've heard about Linda Kajurik, who is sitting in the back. She is our head of rare books and special collections. Taylor McNeely, the archivist, whom you'll hear a little bit about in some of my comments. And then, of course, our provost, Jeff LeGros, who is here. Thank you for your support of this event as well. So I'm going to, what we've discussed with the panel is I'll throw out just a framing question for each. Each one will get an opportunity to say, in response to this question, a few things about their work, their perspective, their relationship to Wyatt T. Walker. We'll move on to the next question, next group of questions, next panelist. Each one will get an opportunity then to introduce him and herself, and perhaps at points we'll begin to respond to each other, and we'll involve you very early on in this discussion. So of course we're here to celebrate the life and legacy of Wyatt T. Walker. Born in 1928 in Brockton, Massachusetts, he rose to the Southern Christian Leadership Conference in 1958 and was executive director from 1960 to 1964. He founded the Congress for Racial Equality in 1958. I've asked each panelist, as I mentioned, to introduce him and herself in these opening remarks. First, I will turn to Corey Walker, who's Vice President, Dean, and Professor of Religion and Society at Virginia Union University. So, Professor Walker, I was asking you and thinking about whether you can talk a little bit about the intellectual tools and traditions to which Wyatt T. Walker begins. Help us to frame in broad terms his relationship to American letters, his context within the broader view and frame of American letters. We'll, of course, talk about nonviolent resistance and the Black theological traditions momentarily, but what else ought we consider with regard to Wyatt T. Walker? What other roots might we make sure are part of our conversation?
First of all, I want to thank you, Dean Rankin, thank you, President Crutcher and Provost LeGros for this wonderful occasion to reflect on an alum of Virginia Union University, a double alum. Wyatt T. Walker graduated with an undergraduate degree in physics and in chemistry from Virginia Union University in 1950, and he stayed on for an additional 3 years in our seminary, where in 1953 he graduated with his Bachelor of Divinity degree from the seminary. When you think of the intellectual formation of Wyatt T. Walker, you really have to think of the intellectual formation of a generation of African American scholars, activists, and true intellectuals who are formed in mid-century America. When you look at Wyatt T.'s formation, he's formed at Virginia Union University. At the time, you have such towering individuals as John Malchus Ellison, who becomes the first African American president of Virginia Union University in 1940. You also have the legacy of Richard I. McKinney, a Yale-trained philosopher who becomes the first dean of the Graduate School of Religion, to which Wyatt T. Walker would eventually go to. You also have the dean of the School of Religion at the time that he was there, Samuel DeWitt Proctor, a true icon in African American religious thought, but most importantly, he's an institution builder that begins to wed the tradition of Black church excellence with the traditions of the academy. So what you have is an individual who moves into a legacy position. His father graduated from Virginia Union University, but more importantly, it was a time of intellectual ferment. Virginia Union was the home of the 1952 inter-seminary movement meeting. It was this long-term meeting of seminary students from seminaries across the nation, both Black and white, that began in the late 19th century, that continued on throughout the 20th century, where Wyatt T. Walker would meet Martin Luther King Jr. And there was one common denominator between that meeting between Wyatt T. and Martin Luther King Jr. on the campus of Virginia Union University. That was none other than Samuel DeWitt Proctor. When you think of Proctor, they are schooling a generation of individuals who are going to be not only to be scholars in the best tradition of intellectuals, but also to use that scholarship in advancing the cause of justice, the cause of democracy, and the cause of world peace. When you look at Walker, Walker becomes part of sort of a laboratory of religious excellence, melding political theory, political theology with the best of a moral background. Much like what Charles Hamilton Houston did at the Howard University Law School, where he saw lawyers as social engineers for justice. The School of Religion at Virginia Union was that incubator, that place where you bring individuals together. But Wyatt T. Walker also did something else. He began to establish and elaborate a way of thinking about African American creative culture and expressive traditions that then brings together the intellectual history of deep knowing about Black music, deep knowledge about Black music, with the ways in which African American music articulates an entirely new imaginary of human being and belonging in the world. When you think of his 1963 article in Negro Digest, which will eventually become Black World, it was that article on the spirituals and freedom that really gestures toward his continued engagement with Black musical traditions throughout his doctoral studies at Colgate Rochester, and of course throughout his continual work throughout the rest of his life on the Black musical tradition. When I look at that 1963 article in Negro Digest, there's only one other book that comes to mind when I think of the depth and acumen that he plumbs around African American spirituals, and that is Howard Thurman's 1947 Ingersoll Lecture on Immortality, The Negro Spiritual Speaks of Life and Death. Here we have two mid-century African-American religious thought leaders and individuals who are promoting a new way of thinking about the world, who are beginning to plumb the depths and the originality of African-American creative expression, not only as just creative expression, but also articulating a deep political sensibility about new ways of organizing human community, and as well as about new ways of thinking about political democracy in the U.S. So Wyatt T. Walker has bequeathed us a deep intellectual tradition, and his formation in these black institutions, both the university and the church, he becomes part of a deep genealogy of black thinkers who can begin to point to alternative ways of thinking about the way in which we organize ourselves intellectually, culturally, and also politically.
Thank you. Is everyone hearing okay? Good volume? Excellent. Thank you so much. You've already touched on this notion of a new imaginary, and I want to transition a little bit to the role of the church in that new imaginary. I've asked Dr. Walker to frame this more broadly, but now I want to touch specifically on the church. We know that Wyatt T. Walker was pastor at Gilfield Baptist Church in Petersburg, Virginia, and then Canaan Baptist Church in Harlem, New York after 1967. And I mentioned Taylor McNeely. You know, our blog recently called attention to a reference in some of our documents right here at the Boatwright Memorial Library regarding a kneeling, in which apparently we had this church tradition of African Americans kneeling at churches. These were Negroes at the time, known as Negroes at the time, attending white churches where it was illegal for them to be, and they would take a knee at the pews. And this reminded our blogger, our librarian who blogged, of Colin Kaepernick and his taking a knee and the backlash against his taking of a knee in regard to civil disobedience, the Nike ad recently. So I've asked Reverend Dorsey, President of Higher Education and Leadership Ministries at the Christian Church, the Disciples of Christ, to speak a little bit more about these religious traditions and context for Reverend Wyatt T. Walker. Are there differences between his activities here in Virginia and in the South, as opposed to his role in Harlem, and then just more broadly about his role in the church?
Thank you, Dr. Rankin. Thank you all for having me here and allowing me to be a part of this incredibly important occasion. My own research recently in the last few years has centered around theology and social movements. I'm particularly interested in the theological underpinnings of some of the most significant social movements in the U.S. history over the last 150 years. Women's suffrage movement, the civil rights movement, even the fundamentalist movement, and the farm workers movement. And so I'm particularly interested in Wyatt T. Walker's work in the context of the civil rights movement. And indeed, he is profoundly theological in his way of articulating the importance of religion as it relates to human improvement. I think it's important to understand, in addition to the moves that you mentioned of him having pastored in Virginia and then pastoring in Harlem, it's also important to reference his work in light of the Great Migration. Walker himself references this in Somebody's Calling My Name in talking about the impact of the Great Migration on sacred music and the role of social transformation in sacred music. And I would submit that the Great Migration itself probably had an impact on Walker's tenure in New York. Now, granted, he was born and raised in the North, but he certainly spent a considerable amount of time in his formational education in the South, pastored in the South. And so by the time Walker returned to the North, he returned to a North that had been transformed, that had had the religious landscape transformed. Many of the churches in the North swelled to historic proportions based on the Great Migration of African Americans, hundreds of thousands of African Americans who migrated from the South, from Mississippi, Alabama, Virginia, Florida, up to the North. And these migratory patterns typically followed a certain route. So people from Mississippi would often end up in Chicago, people in Virginia would end up in Philadelphia and New York. So by the time Walker returns to the North to pastor, he has been virtually baptized in the religious experience of the South. He has also spent time in Atlanta leading the Southern Leadership Conference. And so he returns to take on the role of pastor in a city that has been transformed over the last 40 years by these refugees from the South. And so if you think about it, what has happened to the churches in the North during this time is they have undergone a theological transformation. Churches are no longer simply places where people go to hear preaching and praying. Churches are now places where people go to hear about the human condition, to understand what it is that God has to say about the plight of African Americans, not just in the South, but in the North as well. So by the time Walker assumes the pulpit in New York has changed. Churches like Canaan, churches like Concord, churches like Abyssinian have swollen to historic proportions. And much of this is attributed to the refugees who have come from the South. And so Walker himself is uniquely positioned to pastor in this context. He's uniquely positioned to provide the kind of clarion call to justice that New Yorkers and people all over the North are looking for in black pastors at the time. This has a particular import on sacred music, which is what Walker writes about. It has a huge impact on the evolution of sacred music in the black church. Sacred music in the black church is heavily influenced by issues of freedom. What does it mean to call for freedom? What does it mean for blacks to seek out freedom? And so Walker himself begins writing about this. He begins championing it. And I think that much of what we can see in his success is attributed to his having experienced this migration of his own from his time in the South back to the North, undoubtedly changed by that experience. The last thing that I would like to say by way of bringing this into our time today, we don't have the same kinds of Wyatt T. Walkers today. I think many people lament the dearth of calls for freedom that exist in black sacred music today. And in fact, many of our churches, there are a few exceptions, are no longer places where people are calling for justice, people are demanding accountability. We do have a few. Certainly, one of my mentors, Jeremiah Wright at Trinity, and now Otis Moss III at Trinity in Chicago, Tracy Blackman in St. Louis, Freddie Haynes in Dallas, and there are several other churches throughout the country that are still squarely within the social justice motif. But sacred music is not the same. We have to go outside of black sacred music today to find people who are advocating for and calling for justice. So I would like to submit that the younger generation, the generation of today, is more likely to look to other artists, other sacred music authors to find ways of speaking about today's issues, whether they be police brutality or racial profiling or any number of other social ills. And the one that I would point to, who is probably, I would say, squarely within the tradition of black sacred music and social transformation, would be that black Pulitzer Prize winning psalmist Kendrick Lamar. Kendrick Lamar, partnered with Beyonce on Lemonade, writes these words in her song Freedom. Yeah, open correctional gates and higher gates. Yeah, open our mind as we cast away oppression. Open the streets and watch our beliefs. And when they carve my name inside the concrete, I pray forever it reads freedom. I think we have to find our sacred music that's calling for justice and transformation in places that may not be familiar to those of us who've grown up in the church. And I think we have to be able to be open to that call in different places.
Thank you. Wonderful introduction to that aspect of his work. Do not miss the word that Reverend Dorsey used just now in talking about the Great Migration. He said refugees. Many of you have registered that. We had a wonderful opportunity when he was here, because of course we had to postpone the panel, to talk a little bit about that. And I hope we'll have an opportunity in question and answer to hear where he's going with this notion, because I think it pertains to where we're going next, which is the question of Wyatt T. Walker's local and international scope and reach. We have with us today our Dean for International Education, Martha Merritt, who brought a group to South Africa this summer. In fact, going back to '68, we know that by that time at King's assassination, he was already moving toward a more international front. By his speech beyond Vietnam in '67, he makes the fierce urgency of now an international cause, the Vietnam War. We see this also in Y.T. Walker's broader activity. He studies in Nigeria and Ghana in the 1970s. In our collection, we have this photo album of Nelson Mandela's visit to the United States. This was part of Mandela's visit that he stopped off at Canaan Baptist Church in Harlem, where, of course, Y.T. Walker was pastor. In the collection are also Y.T. Walker's works, South African Odyssey, Soweto Diaries, the African American Church, of course, but in this more international scope. So I've asked our professor, Laura Browder, who's professor of English and American Studies, Tyler Haynes chair, in fact, to talk a little bit about this local and international, because Professor Browder was on this trip this summer as well. You have a work that's rooted in civil rights in Virginia, Growing Up Richmond, which will be, Growing Up Civil Rights, which will be at our museums in the spring. Can you help us to draw the line from Y.T. Walker's local activity, your own understanding of civil rights in Virginia, to the broader scope?
Absolutely, and I think to understand this, we have to go back to a time before Y.T. Walker was even fully conscious, when he was still a toddler, in essence, because the 1930s was really the time when civil rights and civil rights as an international issue first came into prominence in the United States. And this happened through the case of the Scottsboro Boys, which I'm sure most people here are very familiar with. 9 black teenagers who were falsely accused, tried, and given the death penalty on charges of raping 2 white women. And this case, which might have been just another case of injustice, racial injustice, and these youths might have been executed and long forgotten, was instead taken up as a cause both by the NAACP and the Communist Party, which used the Scottsboro case as a way of creating international outrage and activism around the plight of African Americans in the United States, and seeing the plight of especially Southern African Americans as tied into a broader anti-colonial project. So that when Y.T. Walker goes to visit Nelson Mandela on Robben Island, where he's in prison, and later on goes to school in Nigeria and Ghana, this is all part of a much broader project, which says, if you are experiencing Jim Crow in the South, you are tied to other colonial peoples all around the world. So this struggle, which of course had deep theological roots, also had deep organizational political roots with the Communist Party. Because from 1928 on, the cause of African Americans as the leading group of oppressed people of color was a project of international communism. And communists in those days were not as sectarian as they since became. I mean, we have to remember Nelson Mandela was a communist. Most of the members of the South African resistance to apartheid were communists. And in the 1930s especially, communists worked with church groups and church leaders very closely. There was not that stigma about communists in the African American church at that point. And so all of the tools that were in place for Y.T. Walker's career, which so solidly came from the black church, also came from this internationalist organizing tradition. So that when I sat down recently to do interviews with 2 Richmonders who had grown up as teenagers involved in the sit-ins and the protests in the late 1950s and early 1960s, they in turn talked about how significant it was for them when 2 daughters of Bishop Desmond Tutu visited Fourth Baptist Church right here in Richmond to gain support for the anti-apartheid movement. And so I think we need to see Y.T. Walker's career not just in terms of black religious traditions, but also in terms of organizing traditions that had their roots in the late 20s and 1930s and involved many people who were fellow travelers who would not themselves identify as communists, but who learned these incredible organizing techniques and techniques of international solidarity that had begun in 1921 with the founding of the Workers' International Relief, which was an agency that was founded in order to ease the terrible famine then going on in the Soviet Union, but which was later used to help earthquake victims in Japan, famine victims in Ireland and Germany, strikers in England, and so on. And it was the legal arm of the Workers' International Relief, which was called the International Legal Defense, ILD, which later became central in the defense of the Scottsboro Boys in the 1930s. And so I think we need to look at these organizing traditions as well to fully understand the career of Dr. Walker.
Thank you. Reverend, we have one last, by way of introduction, one last question for the panel before we begin to open it up and have them speak to each other perhaps a little bit. But we want to introduce Professor Thad Williamson as well, who is an associate professor in the Jepson School of Leadership here with us today. He has also served as senior policy advisor to Mayor LeVar Stoney, as well as being the first director of Richmond's Office of Community Wealth Building. He was charged there with fighting poverty in the city. And I think he's in a wonderful position to talk a little bit more about Y.T. Walker as we sort of move forward from the 60s into the present day. And I want to call your attention as we move from King's death in 68 forward to some documents that we have in our collection, including a letter from Coretta Scott King thanking Dr. Walker for organizing MLK's funeral. So those are also just to sort of point you in the direction of what we have here in the collection. But, you know, Reverend Dorsey's already brought us a little bit up to the present with his question about sacred music and where young people find spiritual solace and spiritual awakening today. Beyond that, more broadly in the context of civics, Dr. Williamson, I wonder if you could talk a little bit about where you would place this arc of justice today, the movement from urban centers in the 60s to the Richmond of today, and maybe even beyond as we think about Walker's role in organizing civic activities, civil rights, not only in Richmond, but after King's death in places like Pittsburgh and New York.
Certainly. Well, good afternoon, and thank you for the question. And I was very humbled to be participating in this. So, you asked a gigantic question.
It's big.
Yeah. I try my best to confine myself to 5 points in approximately 5 minutes. And the first one is echoing what Dr. Walker has already said, and I think it's critical to recognize that Reverend Y.T. Walker's story as a major figure in American history begins and ends here in Central Virginia. He is one of the many reasons our entire nation owes incalculable debt to our sister institution here in the city of Richmond, Virginia University, and its incredible 150-plus year history of using education as a tool for liberation. And Reverend Walker's rise to national leader was based on his effectiveness in Petersburg and the work he did there, which was both local and statewide. And so in the back of the library's poem display, a second letter from Dr. King to Reverend Walker, which is a reference to a January 1959 march on Richmond to protest massive resistance. And that's an effort I want to circle back to at the close of my comments. I think the second point was that Reverend Walker, and this connects with Dr. Browder just said in certain respects, he's a master of two things we tend to be not so good at, either in our current social movements, such as they are, or what we teach our students and our fellow citizens about social movements. First, he was a master analyst of urban and national power structures. So his truly revolutionary work, and I don't use that word lightly, his revolutionary work in the Birmingham campaign of 1963 was based on the insight that mass action could create a divide between political and economic elites. In Birmingham, the ambitious Project C campaign, Project C for Confrontation, could possibly succeed. So King and Walker wagered correctly that once a massive economic boycott began to tangibly impact the bottom line for those doing business in Birmingham, the business rationality would in time trumped racist ideology. Second, closely related, he was a master, to use the phrase he described about himself, organization man. He put in place plans and structures, both for organizations and for specific campaigns, and he executed them. The meticulous plans married to a broad strategy meant the movement in Birmingham, not the white power structure, would call the shots on their own timeline. That the courage of leaders in the moment of truth in executing the hard parts of the plan would be fortified, and that decisions would be made not on a reactive basis, but in light of long-term goals. We in liberal arts education, and maybe even less in progressive social movements, tend not these days to refer to concepts of personal and organization discipline, as well as rigorous thinking as essential, not optional components of effectiveness, to our ongoing detriment. Third point is that to understand our current moment in Richmond or nationally, we have to reckon with the limitations of what the PBS version of the civil rights movement accomplished. So let's hone in on Richmond. When we look at the periodization of Richmond history, moving out of the most extreme era of Jim Crow, the period between roughly 1948, when Oliver Hill gets elected to the city council, and 1977 can be characterized as a conflict between the movement for black political empowerment in Richmond and a white resistance that itself passed through three distinct stages. First being massive resistance in the 50s, second, token representation and integration in the 60s, and the third, the longest period, which in some respects we're still in, suburban flight and abandonment of the cities, sort of 1970s to pretty recently. So we live now in Central Virginia with the legacy of this compromise made between the civil rights movement and the application of new federal laws and that white power structure. It's not a balanced compromise. It's a compromise that concentrates low-income people of color in urban centers, such we have 40% of our children in the city of Richmond live below the poverty line. It maintains the de facto racial segregation of schools, since school districts in Virginia are locality-based, and has said to African-American protocol here in Richmond that while I can at last elect your own leadership and have a measure of local political power, fundamentally the school system be segregated and widely regarded as inferior to the education offered by the counties. We won't have a regional transportation system. We won't make a reasonable effort to have affordable housing available in the counties. We will not allow the city to annex land and expand geographically, a practice that was once considered routine, standard good government when whites ran the city, but anathema once African Americans took charge in the 1970s. And our white-owned regional newspaper and other media outlets will relentlessly criticize your leadership for failing to miraculously overcome all these problems, while at the same time rejecting out of hand any proposals that could seriously challenge the status quo. And incredibly, many people today in Richmond are oblivious to this history and take our existing arrangements of local government as natural and immutable. With the work of the Office of Community Wealth Building, I was fortunate to work with Mayor Dwight Jones to start and with Mayor Stoney to expand aims to tackle these fundamental structural issues while developing stronger pathways for Richmond families to move out of poverty. And today I think there is an emerging stronger consensus we've ever had in Richmond that our social conditions with respect to poverty and educational inequities are simply unacceptable, and that we can and must do something significant to address them. Yet as we move forward as a city with our community wealth building work, it's instructive to look at what Reverend Walker did in that long period of his career after the death of Dr. King and his work with Canaan Baptist Church of Christ and with community development corporations in central Harlem. He worked with government. This next little phrase isn't in the script, although you all know this well. He worked with the Republican New York Governor Nelson Rockefeller and community organizations to build affordable housing based on a holistic community approach and large scale. He worked to establish a new school, the Sisulu Walker School, committed to offering a rigorous, excellent education to children in central Harlem. In short, he was a community wealth builder determined to utilize and mobilize the political, moral, and financial resources on hand to meet the education, employment, and housing needs of the people in central Harlem he was responsible to. So this is a model Richmond and others would do well to follow. Fourth, again, echoing what has already been said, his vision, like Dr. King's, extended seamlessly from the local to the global. And we've talked about his anti-apartheid work already, but I think that demonstrates something that's still true but underappreciated. Just because your side is out of power at the national level does not mean nothing can be done about the issues you care about most. Local movements and solidarity with global actors can be another method for influencing the actions of our national government and of course the global events. Indeed, those who care about social justice should never be surprised that our side is out of power at any given moment. If I could summarize in one sentence Reverend Walker's remarkable career as an organizer, leaving aside his vast contributions in other arenas, it was that he was extremely astute and effective both at challenging power when he didn't have it and at using it well when he did. So and that brings me to my last point, coming back to Virginia. So as I mentioned, in 1958, 60 years ago, Reverend Walker requested that Dr. King send correspondence to his network of black ministers across Virginia indicating his support for January 1, 1959 march on Richmond to protest mass resistance. And his request to Dr. King was if he supported, people will come. In fact, it was a snowy day. The people did come in large numbers for a historic march. So he drafted this letter to Dr. King stating as follows, quote, Virginia has the opportunity to give direction and destiny to our troubled South. As Virginia goes, so goes the South, perhaps America and the world. So I believe Reverend Walker was right in 1958, and I believe the same statement is true in 2018. And completely coincidentally, or maybe not, it happens last week, Mayor LeVar Stoney, an African American, and our Caucasian Superintendent Jason Cameras jointly announced last week plans for marching the Capitol on December 8th to demand that the Commonwealth of Virginia provide greater, more equitable school funding to the city of Richmond and other distressed urban localities. The march will stop at the Martin Luther King Middle School, across the Martin Luther King Jr. Bridge, and move on to the state capitol. So I have no doubt that Reverend Walker and Dr. King will be there in spirit, but also feel very certain that he would ask and expect all of us that we be there in body, too. Both to continue the work against racism and inequality they undertook 60 years ago, and to meet our moral obligations to this community's children and their futures here and now.
I think you've gotten a sense of the scope of this panel and why we chose these particular speakers, the breadth spanning from the 1930s and the African-American interaction with the Communist Party and Soviet Union. I think of Langston Hughes as put another S in the USA and make it Soviet. But coming all the way up to lemonade. And I want to sort of give a chance for the audience to begin to have your questions and think about how you might engage with the panel. But I wonder, Reverend Dorsey, if you might say a little bit more, given this notion of refugees and its both local, historic in the case of the United States and the Great Migration, what you mean by it in terms of borders today, and what you might mean by it internationally in terms of how we conceive of citizenship locally and internationally. Big question, but you might begin to just maybe lay out a little bit of what you spoke to us about when you visited last, and then I'll look around to see if anyone in the audience might want to begin to get involved in the conversation.
I think it's a huge issue. The status of refugees has always been an issue with respect to democracies and the emergence of the modern nation state. The modern nation state is built on a certain kind of homogeneity of persons within a certain geographic boundary, and whenever that homogeneity is compromised, challenged, or pulled at by mass migration of individuals who do not fit that homogeneity, it creates problems. It places demands on the democracy that a democracy is typically not prepared to acquiesce to. And so when you think about the plight of African Americans, the descendants of slaves who were freed by the Constitution, still living in the Jim Crow South, living in the midst of terrorism, living in the midst of economic desperation, fleeing these conditions in the South to go north, it can only be described as refugees. I think when we say Great Migration, we also have to think refugees. I think fast forward to today, and we still have similar problems, whether it's migrants fleeing the devastation in war-torn parts of sub-Saharan Africa, trying to cross the Saharan, getting across Morocco and getting into Europe, or if it's refugees coming from Central and South America trying to flee situations of violence. The status of refugees is of tantamount importance when we consider the nature of democracy. Democracies are never about minorities. They're never about those who are not part of the homogeneous majority. And so we have that problem still today. And so I think it's something that we have to continue to wrestle with. And so, again, going back to Wyatt T. Walker, the sacred songs are the songs of minoritized persons. They're the songs of refugees. They're the songs of those who are striving against the hegemony of a democracy for rights that have not been realized.
I think of redlining in Chicago, right? If you're traveling from the south to Chicago, but you can't find housing because of redlining, of course you are a refugee. So that's, and it links right back up to what Professor Williamson was talking about in terms of housing today. 40% of children living below the poverty line in the city of Richmond. That's staggering. Anyone from the audience want to get involved? Yes, thank you.
So I'll ask a question.
Provost,
I'll ask a question to get things going. So I was intrigued by Reverend Dorsey and your comments about the waning of the church and the movement for equality. And yet on the same panel, we've got Reverend Dr. Walker, and you're in charge of a theological institute. I was just interested, do you share that view, and if, and you know, where do you see the kind of center of the movement going if it isn't the church? Has it moved to sports leaders? I mean, Copernic reference, and struck by the comments, you know, how the church was powerful in so many ways, culturally, emotionally, and also connections to others who might support the movement for equality, white congregations who might be of a like mind. And just interested if that exists in other entities today, or if you maybe still believe the church is kind of at the center of this.
Well, I think what we have is, pick up on what Thad said, that we have a very underdeveloped notion of the civil rights movement. And in many ways, it is what we think of as the modern Black freedom movement. What erupts in the late 40s throughout the 60s becomes the latest eruption of the struggle for freedom in the U.S. And African Americans are leading that. Here in Virginia, we remember that it's Barbara Johns, a 16-year-old student, high school student, who begins the walkout in Prince Edward County. What you have also are individuals who are connected. The church provides us a way in which individuals are connecting with other groups. So if I'm thinking of the Black church, I'm not only thinking in the 30s with the Communist Party, but if we think a little bit longer, you have the Pan-Africanist movement that begins at the turn of the century. You have the Africa conferences that are being held at historically Black colleges, beginning at Tuskegee, at Hampton, that move around also at Fisk, that begin to think globally about the exercise of Black freedom. That freedom in the U.S. is not disconnected from expressions of freedom around the world. Indeed, W.E.B. Du Bois, in his wonderful book of 1920, Darkwater, would talk about white supremacy as the global width of the thing, the imperial width of the thing, the move across all spaces. This echoes his 1903 line around the color line. The color line just isn't in the U.S. Du Bois draws the color line globally. It is about the works of Asia and Africa and the islands of the sea. So we have this global white supremacy that individuals are wrestling against and battling against. So you're finding folks like Chandler Owen, a 1913 graduate of Virginia Union University, who would connect up with someone like A. Philip Randolph and become part of the Black radical tradition of the Messenger. And they'll start the Messenger in 1919. They'll also connect with the Black institutional church movement. That's a movement at the turn of the century where they connect, where Black churches are providing spaces not only for religious services, but also for the spaces where the state does not occupy. I mean, when you think of the truncation of the U.S. state to a white supremacist state, That means all of the legitimate services that the state offers are only geared toward one segment of the society. Hence, African Americans had to create an alternative state structure. It wasn't just because of Black African Americans' ingenuity. It was because we occupied a white supremacist state. And the state only offered goods and services to those that were deemed legitimate citizens, as Chris was talking about. When you think of a white supremacist state and then how to organize against it, that means you have to move all structures across all formations. So you're not just looking at state formations or what is properly political, meaning how do we march for rights. You're also going to look at how do you build alternative structures. This is where Wyatt T is part of a longer Black intellectual tradition of creating those alternative structures, to look at how do you access state resources to redirect them to develop African American communities. If we look at the 1970s and what he's doing in New York with Nelson Rockefeller, Wyatt T. Walker is also part of Rockefeller's, Governor Rockefeller's observation group that goes into Attica. So we understand some of the things that are going on in terms of criminalization of Black bodies and the mass incarceration of Black bodies in those rebellions with the necessity for community development. So if I'm looking at grants where I can open up charter schools, then I will access that, but then I will develop a charter school that can then tap into Black genius. This is what we have a problem with in Richmond. This is what we have a problem with in public schools. It's not only the non-support of public schools, it is the epistemic inability to deal with and cultivate Black genius. So what Wyatt T brings into account is not only let me create the institutions, but I also have to create the intellectual infrastructure to then cultivate the genius of these groups. Hence, when we talk about his work with Black sacred music, what he's really defining is the notion of Black genius that is not just musical. It is political theory. It is the ways in which we think about space-time. It is the ways in which individuals are beginning to compress and articulate an entirely new intellectual genealogy. So you're wrestling with the church as a site, but the church becomes one site within an entire network. It's almost like a rhizomatic formation. The church becomes one hub amongst all other hubs. And to think Wyatt T. Walker, you're thinking the church. I'm also thinking Black expressive cultures. I'm also thinking Black institutions. I'm also thinking Black civic and cultural groups, because Wyatt T. Walker was big on the ways in which social and civic organizations could then put pressure on the state. And I'm also thinking about these things globally, because it is never in isolation. The U.S. is never in isolation within the Black intellectual imaginary. You're always thinking global.
If I could just add one part to it, I think that I didn't mean to say that the church is completely ineffective. What I meant to say is that the numbers are not there. We certainly have leaders of the church, particularly the Black church, as those that I mentioned, and I could also mention William Barber as another leader within the Black church who's speaking out on issues of justice and certainly commanding a significant audience. But Charles Tilley, who wrote one of the quintessential books on social movements, talks about the need for worthiness, unity, numbers, and commitments as a part of an effective social movement. And as far as the church is concerned, what I'm concerned about is that the numbers that we have seen in the past are not there. And so the numbers of people within the church are not at the level they were. And I agree with my friend Corey about the need for broad-based coalitions. I mean, this is South Africa and COSATU and many of the other movements around the world have always relied on alliances, solidarity. But I was speaking specifically about the dwindling numbers of the church and the dwindling numbers of people who are specifically concerned about issues of social justice and social movement.
Well, I think, one thing that we also have to remember is how traditionally the Black church and other institutions have had a kind of porousness, right? Which is maybe not quite as present today, so that you would have important figures. I completely agree with you, Corey, about the incredible Black radical intellectual ferment at the beginning of the century. We have to remember that people like W.E.B. Du Bois moved in and out of a number of social movements. He ended up a communist. He didn't begin as a communist. And many radicals were working in a number of different groups simultaneously, so that when Claude McKay gets up in Moscow in front of the Comintern and talks about where is communism really thriving in an integrated way, Richmond, Virginia. It's the only city that has an integrated black and white communist movement that is also involved with churches and other institutions. So I think if we're going to talk about social movements, we have to remember that people move in and out of different orbits very fluidly in social movements, and that when you have strong churches with a basis in social justice, you also have strong labor movements, right? And strong, non-sectarian political movements, and they are all working in solidarity and working in Congress, and we're missing a lot of those elements today.
Yes, please.
If we look at Dr. Walker's work and then look at the Kerner Commission report, where do we go from here? Because you look at the Kerner Commission report, it has the data, what we need to do, but nothing has been done. Where do we go from here?
Before the panel answers that question, I'm going to do a very shameless plug, and Kirsten, who has the microphone, might be able to help me with the dates. As part of this series we have in the School of Arts and Sciences, Contested Spaces, Race, Nation, and Conflict, we will have a panel hosted by our Department of Journalism on the Kerner Commission, on the heels of the 50th anniversary of the Kerner Commission report.
It's going to be November 9th, it's a Friday, very soon hereafter, and information can be found on Arts and Sciences website. So it's Contested Spaces, Race, Media, and Journalism.
So please come back for that. Panelists, anything, if they don't want to wait till early November. or perhaps a teaser for
Yeah.
I had to write a number of sort of 50th anniversary of War and Poverty type articles a few years ago. And so the Kerner Commission, President Johnson was hoping it would announce that he was doing a great job, keep on doing what he was doing, and he was on the right track. And it's an interesting story that the commission, including Republicans, in the prosecuting their work, kind of got radicalized. And produced this report that was a very comprehensive and detailed critique of not just urban America, but really the society as a whole. And the short answer is what happened, Richard Nixon happened. In terms of, and I would take him over a lot that's happened since then in terms of social policy. But Nixon tried to put a block on further progress in the Great Society, and his sort of hostility towards welfare bureaucrats and that kind of thing, that became the new discourse. And there's many books, Fessel Weaver has written one, and a couple others as well, who've talked about how at the same time the war on poverty was crescendoing, there was a counter-narrative that quickly took hold, which framed the whole issue in terms of crime, and making a war on crime, which very quickly turns into a war on basically black people, for black people. So that's basically what happened in the 70s and 80s, and it didn't happen all at once. It goes over for a 10 to 15 year period. But I'm not sure there ever was genuine political support for what Kerner Commission was talking about, but if there had been anybody plausible in American politics, it would have been Robert Kennedy. We know what happened.
Okay.
I think we got to begin, and Thad has gestured toward this. It's not to think of these movements as sequential. I mean, at the moment that you have the Black freedom struggle, you have an intense white backlash. When White T. Walker and King are organizing, they're not only organizing for black freedom and within a white supremacist nation, they're also having to organize against a black leadership class that's invested in the continuation of a particular type of political patronage. Hence, they have to create the Progressive National Baptist Convention. So it is never just one thing. And as Thad said, when you're thinking about the Black freedom struggle, I'm thinking of Goldwater in 1964. You don't get a Goldwater campaign galvanizing individuals, galvanizing the white electorate in 64 without there being a continual support for a politically divided and racially divided nation. It wasn't until 1968 and the Green versus New Kent County case that the Brown v. Board decision of 1964 becomes real. This is 1968 because we have legitimate structures that are then continue to operate along the logic of a white supremacist state. And of course, when we get Nixon, we may get Nixon with opening up of China. Nixon also becomes the one that opens up with affirmative action. But this is something King warned about in 1964. King said, look, there will be people who betray the movement because they want access to the table. This is what Wyatt T. Walker and King understood all too well, that if you want just access to the table, that will come. It's much like King saying, well, in about 25 years, there will be a black president, but the question becomes, will you have black freedom? And King said this also in 64. And of course, when we get Barack Obama, it is as if it had never happened or no one had never imagined this. What about the Gary, Indiana political convention in '72, where you have a movement from movement politics to electoral politics? And you have a shift from the ways in which you begin to challenge the dominant political structures to transform them to, we want a particular representation, a representational politics. What we're seeing now is, now you have an organized and an organizing tradition that's on the street, and you have that organized and organizing tradition on the street, forcing a political class to respond. But what you also have in our contemporary moment is the reorganization of a white supremacist polity that continues to manifest and hold those structures of power. This is, of course, with Nixon, but of course, once we get Reagan in 1980, you have the transformation, the fundamental transformation of our institutions of governance to 1994, when Newt Gingrich would say, I am a revolutionary. We are true revolutionaries, and we're going to march through the structures of government. So there's a way in which we have to have a deep understanding and analysis of how movements for change, both movements for progressive change, for a multiracial polity, and movements to maintain a status quo white supremacist policy can operate simultaneously. And then how do you seize the operations of power of state machinery to then institutionalize those changes such that we can gut the the Voting Rights Act of '65 in 2013 and have legitimate gerrymandering in 2018.
Thank you.
I would add one more thing, and that is, I think we have to learn to question anew the very foundation of our democracy, and that is that it is built on something that is antithetical to the protection and the bolstering of human rights. That to the extent that we favor a majority form of governance, then we favor a form of governance where the majority of people decide how to distribute the majority of the resources to themselves. And so until we learn how to interrogate that fundamental reality and to ask ourselves the question over and over again, where are the least of these in the context of a democracy, then we will never, no matter what policies we come up with, no matter what laws we pass, no matter what voting rights act we put in place, we will never come to terms with that fundamental weakness. And so I think that, and that's not to say that democracy is a bad thing. It says that it needs a counterbalance to it. Because left unchecked, democracies will always favor the majority, and they will always favor the distribution of resources in favor of a majority. And so we cannot change that until we develop the right kinds of tools to interrogate that weakness. And I think for much of the history of this at least since the Second Great Awakening, the church has filled that role. The church would often rise up to speak on behalf of the least of these, whether it was 18th century evangelicals or the civil rights movement of the 20th century. The church usually filled that role, whatever the religious entity is. And I think we have lost the ability to really do that. So I would say that would be what I would add to it.
That's the critical question that de Tocqueville raised in Democracy in America about majoritarian politics. And de Tocqueville also raised the other thorny issue. The longest chapter in both volumes is the chapter on the three races in America. In many ways, we have yet to rise to the challenge of de Tocqueville's the three races in America, talking about whites, blacks, and Native Americans. And of course, we know we attenuated the vote for Native Americans simply because if they were voting in the numbers in which they were properly represented, you would actually have individuals give up power. So those issues have been with us at the beginning of the Republic, and they're continuing with us. And you're right, we have not had a way to leaven that. And with the collapse of civil society, I mean, we're in a situation now where the U.S. is in a legitimation crisis, where the very idea of democracy is at stake. And at that moment where you have a polity that no longer believes in the idea, you open up possibilities for alternative forms of authoritarian politics. That's the danger we're in.
That's you mean Trump.
Trump becomes but a symptom of a deeper issue that has constantly stalked the American democratic enterprise.
We got problems.
My question is less heavy.
Please. Say who you are for the audience.
I'm Aaron Gellman, I teach in the history department here, and I was curious if the panelists would talk about the meaning of having Reverend Walker's papers at an institution like this one. What that says.
Say what you mean by an institution like that.
An institution with a history is primarily white and white supremacist, an institution that has struggled to connect with a city that's majority black, an institution that struggles still to make a workable definition of diversity in 21st century America. There's real meaning to having Reverend Walker's papers enter an institution like this, become part of its knowledge base and its intellectual, maybe even traditions. And I was curious what hopes or opportunities and challenges you saw in that.
My.
Somebody got to say something. To the hardest question, there's a bigger issue I can't even begin to think how to address. I don't know the story of why the papers ended up here.
Okay.
And as a scholar here, I would say I'm incredibly happy they're here. And so I'll say this: I teach social movements class. I'm going to do it again next fall. I'm going to be talking to Taylor back there. I want to make, of course, a deep dive in his archive, because to me this is a great chance. So often with our students, we try to go broad, we try to cover so much, and one of the things in this discussion, there's such a huge body of knowledge that our students have to even be competent people of the 21st century. And that's all great, but at some point you have to go deep. And I think there's a different value in going deeper, and through this person's life, we can stretch in so many directions between local, national, and global as they all come up. So I want to do a course like that. I'll put an open invitation to anyone who wants to do this with me, or at Virginia Union or another institution. I would love to have a partner in that. So I'd say, I mean, we have it, we have a responsibility to use it the best possible way.
And I'll add to that, that I think that our students here and the community around the University of Richmond is thirsty for an opportunity to try and create an alternative future to our white supremacist past. Because that's what the university was about since its inception, and it's going to take a long time to undo that legacy, to see that legacy for what it is, and to undo it. And I, too, am incredibly grateful and thankful for the opportunity to have this amazing archive to teach our students, because our students really want to learn. And I think our students too often come to us with this very flat understanding of what the civil rights movement was all about. And it's an understanding that begins and ends with Martin Luther King. And then after that, everything was hunky-dory and there are no more problems and let's move on. And I think for our students to be able to understand what a lifelong freedom struggle is all about, that stretches from the extremely local to the global, is going to be a gift to them that we cannot underestimate, and it will be a gift for generations and generations to come. And I hope will be instrumental in transforming this university into a place that we can all feel incredibly proud of, rather than sort of shameful of the white supremacist foundation on which we all work.
I'm going to look at this quite differently. The acquisition of the Wyatt T. Walker papers represents a moment in the institutional reformation around the University of Richmond, learning how to become a university and live into its ideal of a university in the 21st century. It's not so much about what students need to know. It is how do you educate an institution, which is supposed to be the repository of knowledge for a society, to begin to understand and expand the very idea of what it means to produce, reproduce forms of knowledge and pass them on to new communities and to new students. What the Walker Papers does is it intervenes in our current production of knowledge in the U.S. and globally, to then call into question the very adequacy of those modes of knowing and the ways in which we've organized the university heretofore. What Walker does is he reminds us of a way in which the questions that we raise about the fundamental organization of knowledge do not just pertain to our disciplinary organization of the university, but opens up the opportunity for a reorganization of the university to attain a level of human knowledge about the human condition that can then open up new possibilities for expanding the very terrain of freedom and the terrain of human understanding. The Walker Papers are a radical intervention in the life not only of the University of Richmond, but into the American university and dominant universities writ large across the world. What we're part of is a part of what we see in our brother and sister institutions across the world. I look at the institutions in South Africa who are asking for a decolonization of the university. In many ways, this is what the Walker Papers here at the University of Richmond represent, is a very decolonization of the university. Here is an opportunity for us not to just have classes, but to then begin to restructure how we think about curriculum, how we think about academic programs, how we think about the individuals that we invite to join our intellectual community. How do we then attain a level of knowledge? How do we then attain a level of understanding to begin to interrogate the Walker Papers? How would I read Wyatt T. Walker's 1965 article on Malcolm X in Negro Digest as a question around the ideal of the black masculine and the crisis of black masculinity in connection with the Kerner Commission case of the Kerner Commission report of 1968? What does that mean for how we narrate the very ways in which we think about historical chronology and historical genealogy? How do we then begin to interrogate the ways in which we think of the sociological functions of categorizing populations of human people, of human beings as criminals and as deviant? In many ways, we will now have to revise the very ideas of what it means to be a professor here at the University of Richmond, as well as how we begin to define the organization of knowledge in the modern university because of these Walker Papers. In many ways, we're now on a trajectory to begin to define and understand how we understand the emergence and cultivation of genius in the world. That is the organization of a true university for not only the 21st century, but also for a new humanity.
So I was asked to give a little bit of background into how the papers came to the University of Richmond. I'm Kathy Lang, and I run the Institute on Philanthropy. Back several years ago when Dr. Ayers was the president, he started the day that we closed the university and celebrated MLK Day. And that was the same week that Joseph Evans was here. Joseph can tell the story, I'm sure, a lot better than I can. So Joseph came to the Institute for a week of learning about fundraising. He came back and learned about planned giving. He started writing a book, and he spent time in Petersburg with Dr. Walker. And during those times when he was using the papers, he asked questions. He just simply did what he told me that he learned from the Institute, which was, what are you going to do with the papers? Dr. Walker said that there were several places that were looking to receive them, but he wanted to keep those papers in Virginia at a university. He talked about the University of Richmond and his experience here during MLK Day, and really felt like when he came back again, that the university would be a great place to steward those papers. So Joseph will be here later, and he will, I'm sure, give you a much better story than that.
Thank you. You have another question?
Hi, my memory of people is simple. I grew up in the Petersburg area before I came to college in the Richmond area, and came to know the movement in the mid-'60s. I didn't get to meet Dr. Walker in Petersburg, but he was a legend, and he was particularly well known, and there's a Richmond connection, because he was among a small group of people, and every time this happened in the 50s and the 60s, it was a radical thing. You stepped out front, you got your spouse if you were lucky, you got a few friends, in his case, some of the fellow preachers that were part of that band of preachers that changed America, and were led by Dr. Martin Luther King and others. But he decided he was going to integrate the Petersburg Public Library. And he really aggravated the people by going in and asking for a book that was by someone dear to this university. Douglas Southall Freeman's biography of Robert E. Lee. You've obviously heard it.
What?
But my point is, my memory of him, and I met him in 1963 when the Southern Christian Leadership Conference was here in Richmond. And went to that convention for 3 days, and it changed my life. I immediately started volunteering with Virginia Union students to register voters, and have been active ever since. But my impression, of course, was of someone who stepped out in front of his community and dared to join with others and change the world. Thank you to his family, and a challenge to any of the young people here who have opportunities to do some of the same.
I want to be a little daring here and play around with the phrase that's been brought up by many of our speakers, white supremacy. I want to maybe dig in a little bit with that phrase and think of it in terms of a kind of implicit bias on a global scale. You know, in the United States, I think back to Thomas Jefferson. In my own research, there is an African-American woman named Phyllis Wheatley who wrote a body of poetry that was published in 1773. Her master wrote that she had an inclination for the Latin tongue. And this was brought to Thomas Jefferson's attention, as were the examples of Benjamin Banneker and others. He could not believe it. People would send him letters and accomplishments of blacks at the time, and he just couldn't believe it. And he writes the following: "No person living wishes more sincerely than I do to see a complete refutation of the doubts I have myself entertained and expressed on the grade of understanding allotted to them by nature, and to find that in this respect they are on par with ourselves." So he searches and searches, and to his mind cannot find that blacks are his equal, which again sort of sets up the institutions of slavery. We can come forward to Frederick Douglass, who even in his interaction with William Lloyd Garrison marvels in his writing at how Garrison looked on him, even someone who wanted his liberation. And he says, quote, Frederick Douglass, quote, "The force of our education stood in their own way. They did not delve into the mind of a colored man for capacities which the pride of race led them to believe to be restricted to their own Saxon blood." Frederick Douglass, writing of the light gaze upon him. So I just want to sort of anchor this phrase in some history, some thinkers in the States, so that we know we're not just sort of throwing around this phrase, but that we're talking about an institution that's compounded generation after generation, and we're seeing it more recently in activities in places like Charlottesville and so on. Does anyone else want to unpack this idea, this phrase for our audience?
Yeah.
All right.
I think what Dean Rankin, what you point to is really the ways in which sedimented and categorical ways of thinking help us to cognate and make sense of the world. And so when we have something that doesn't quite make sense, like a Latin-speaking Negro, in the case of 18th century Phyllis Wheatley, or even a 20th century freedom fighter who is, at the same time he's leading SCLC, writing about freedom themes in black spiritual music, it's cognitive dissonance. Because the cognitive dissonance is built upon a platform in which you understand that certain forms of cognition only pertain to certain classes of people. So if I'm looking for forms of intellectual elocution, if I'm looking at forms of ways of thinking about the world, then I have to go to a certain person that fits that categorical framework. That helps organize our chronologies, or even the ways in which we organize our universities. They're organized around a categorical frame. That white supremacist activity doesn't mean that it's just about those bad white supremacists out there in Charlottesville. It is the ways in which it inheres in our minds that certain modes of existence, certain modes of thinking, certain modes of being have a particular distinct genealogy, and we may not be vicious with them, implicit bias, but they help us to organize and cognate the world. What you're moving toward is not only the recognition of the limitation of that cognition of the world, it also gestures toward, now how do we begin to think of alternative possibilities? How do we go back to those tables back there with the Wyatt T. Walker papers and read them with fresh eyes and fresh minds? In many ways, if we go back there with the categorical frames that we already have, i.e. civil rights, i.e. where is Martin Luther King, i.e. how do we deal with marches, we're going to miss the ways in which Wyatt T. Walker is working with and having to negotiate with the students, with the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, and alternative ways of thinking about leadership. When you think of Ella Baker's leadership style and you think of Wyatt T. Walker's leadership style, there are two different leadership frameworks, and they do have some conflict and tension, particularly around young people. But if our categorical frames aren't attuned to it, if we're not decolonizing our own minds, then we will never be able to read those papers. And in many ways, we continue, even those within a black body, can then bring a colonized mind to understanding these particular forms and frameworks. It's not a normative injunction against that. It is the ways in which a white supremacist world, since modernity, has organized itself intellectually and then reproduced that intellectual reorganization of the world, such that we're now in a moment where the awakening from that intellectual moment then causes this moment of cognitive dissonance. And of course, we want to run back. It's almost like the Platonic cave. We can run back to the cave, but we've seen the light now. We can't go back to that cave. And there's a whole new way of thinking about the world that's opened up to us.
I want to affirm but also challenge some of what is is operating, at least in this question, in this conversation, and that is the basic value of humanity. I think part of what we struggle with, particularly in an environment such as ours, this is an academic institution, is that we are constantly asking questions about the value of intellect and intellectual capacity and intellectual achievement. And I think the fundamental question needs to be a little bit different. It isn't whether or not a human being can aspire to intellectual achievement. It's whether or not human beings can experience their full dignity. And I think that's a different kind of question. That's not to take away from I certainly affirm the analysis, but I want to come back to what was inherent in the civil rights movement, what has always been inherent in most social movements, and that is the basic dignity of human beings. And I think, if you look at the women's suffrage movement, it was almost 75 years from Seneca Falls until women got the right to vote. We lose sight of that fact. We don't, in our historical way of understanding it, we spend maybe 2 days in high school history learning about the women's suffrage movement that spans almost 75 years. And so the question was never about women's intellectual capacity. It was about the basic dignity of human beings to participate fully in a society. And I think if we keep pushing ourselves to ask those questions, if we pay attention to different things, we pay a different attention. Yes, we need to ask questions about the collection and why it's here and what it will do here and how it will enrich the lives of people who live here. But a deeper question is, what will the papers do? What will this institution do about the caravan of refugees coming from Central America, coming to the borders of this country,
right now,
seeking to have their dignity affirmed by the greatest nation on the earth? And so I think I always want us to come back to those questions. Yes, intellectual capacity and achievement is important, but how do we analyze it in light of human dignity?
And in light of time, which I think is a really important thing that you raised, that these social movements are very, very long. And it takes an enormous amount of time and struggle, and ongoing struggle and attention to the universal need and right to dignity. And so now when we're living in a moment where every day we hear of a new assault on people's dignities, right? Coming from the very highest office of this land, it is very, very easy to lose hope and lose momentum because the challenges seem so enormous. But remembering how long these struggles for freedom and dignity have gone on, and how in many ways how successful they have been, even in the face of almost insuperable obstacles. I think that having the Walker Papers here and connecting what Dr. Walker did with freedom struggles all over the world is going to be an important way for our students to become the kind of fully engaged citizens that they need to be, so that they notice. Because I think one of the things about the struggle for human dignity is that if you choose, it's very, very easy in this country to not notice the struggles of those around you and of those in other places of the world. And having this example before us of what a struggle that took place over decades can mean, what it can achieve, but also what it can mean and what kind of a model it can be. I mean, I think that's really going to be the thing that can possibly change the lives of those here at the university.
Professor Grauer, not only do we close our eyes, we move away. I mean, right?
We love to
west
move
of
away.
the city. We move away from downtown. And so, Professor Williamson, and then I know there's a question in the audience.
Yeah, so 2 points on this question about white supremacy. To bring it back to the practical component, the community well-building component of for Walker's work, actually providing people jobs, housing, education, the things of a decent life. I think this is still central to the project of dismantling white supremacy, both for its own sake, those are good things to do, but so long as we have these massive economic gaps of wealth and power that are racialized, the majority group will continue to harbor suspicion there's something innately racial about these disparities and put the institutional and historical stuff to the side. And if you want evidence of this, you read the Richmond Times-Dispatch today. In the letter to the editor, they printed a letter which basically disparages the RPS's recent equity audit on grounds, quote, to the effect, well, if black students are in the same classrooms with white students, the same teachers, why are these inequities of outcomes? And first of all, that's factually false. By and large, black students are not in the same classrooms with the same teachers as white students in the city, or even worse, in the regional. So first of all, it's a false claim. But secondly, behind that is clearly a disparaging racial component. Right there, printed in the paper. Nobody thought that was problematic to print it. And so there's that component. We have to tackle the economic inequities head on. But also the second part, instead of your question, and I think Dr. Walker again touched on it in a way, is what is the alternative to white supremacy? Right now we're at a point it's going to be white supremacy or democracy, but it's not going to be both. You know, it can't be both because of the demographic change. And so at the moment we're in, and probably will be the next 10 to 20 years, is white political forces trying to hold on to power and resist change any way they can. You see it in the voter suppression efforts in Georgia and elsewhere. And so either we're going to turn into something we've never been, an inclusive multiracial democracy, and we're going to affirm that as who we are, or we're going to turn to another version of South Africa. I mean, that's really what the stake in is. So again, I love your response on the papers. For an institution like University of Richmond, our history, being very clear about who we are and what we stand for, and that we affirm the better version of that story, is hugely significant. So I thank you for your intervention in helping us understand ourselves and the possibilities of this much better.
I think we lost the mic, but Professor Howard, did you want? Okay. So we're going to begin wrapping up. If there's a burning comment in the audience, wonderful. We'll take that, please. Yes.
Craig Coker, University Chaplain. First of all, thank you all. This is really helpful. I don't need a response from everybody on this. I just, maybe from Dr. Walker, I wonder, I'm struck by the religious history of the University of Richmond. We are a white Baptist institution. We are founded in that story. We're celebrating one of the great Baptist leaders in American history whose papers are now at the University of Richmond. And so as I think about the religious history of the university, our spiritual future, could you just offer maybe a brief reflection on the intersection of those two things, his theological vision and what that might mean, where we've been as an institution and our future?
I'm going to draw on what Chris raised, and that was a question of human dignity, but I'm going to raise it around the question of what precedes that notion of dignity, the human. In many ways, what Baptists have done, and the Baptist contribution to the religious ecology of the U.S., is to really ground a notion of the inherent respect of the human personality. What Black Baptists have contributed is a very desegregation of the idea of what it means to be human in the world. And they've desegregated the human. What Wyatt T. Walker and people like Martin Luther King and other Baptist leaders have done is to begin a deep theological excavation of the ways in which we have attenuated what it means to be human in the world, such that anything that we attach to it automatically takes a normative stance that excludes the Black. What they're writing back into it is that to be human is to be Black in the world. To be religiously Black in the world is to then understand a notion of an inclusive creator God that then creates all of humanity. What Wyatt T. Walker has done is opened up an opportunity for us to begin to think of the ways in which an inclusive expansion of our religious imaginary can then inform and frame a new inclusive expansion of our political imaginary that is not predicated on a truncated notion of the human, but then fundamentally refines and redefines what it means to be human in the world. So what the University of Richmond has to offer is not only a way in which a university reorganizes and remakes itself, it also has the way of how do we reorganize and rethink and fundamentally rethink the human in the world and what it means to be human. That is a fundamental and revolutionary proposition, and that's the legacy of Wyatt T. Walker and what these papers represent in our moment to this day. A new way of being human in the world.
Whoa.
What'd you say?
Whoa.
Amen, amen. Well, so I want to thank the panelists. I want to thank you for your attention over the course of the past hour and some. I also want to once again call your attention to our series in the School of Arts and Sciences, Contested Spaces, Race, Nation, and Conflict, because many of the topics that we have begun to discuss today, we will be digging into throughout the year. This is a kind of kickoff for us in that series. So I've already mentioned race, media, and journalism, where we'll dig into the Kerner Report and its 50th anniversary. But also, we've heard a little bit about refugees. And we have a series called Migration, the Contested Spaces of the Mediterranean, and that's in March 24 to March 26. So please take a look at our website. Please come back and join us for those events. But more immediately, we have some treats for you here now for the next hour. We have some time.